Welcome back to Joshua's Magic. Me and my friend Nick Taylor here are going to be having a discussion, see what higher energies we can tune into, what thoughts and ideas we might elucidate. So strap in, everybody, and enjoy the. So how's it going today, Nick? I know I sort of woke you up real early to do this.
Yeah, it's going okay. I'm running on not a whole lot of sleep, but sometimes that's when the best ideas come, I guess.
Oh yeah.
So how is everything in the world of grand ideas? What's sort of been stirring around your mind lately?
Oh, grand ideas. I don't know. Well, I had some impressions about just like higher stuff coming down, and it's funny how it sort of comes in waves. Like this one impression of something happening, and then you start to see it happen, and then it slowly comes down to reality, and then there's sort of like a dry period to some degree, and now I've got this other impression of something coming down. So it'd be interesting to see how that shakes up. But it has to do with the word order. I've been getting that word a lot. I mean, I've actually been getting that word for like maybe a year, if not longer. But I guess the connotation's a little bit expanded now, so that's pretty interesting.
So is that I don't want to get too esoteric right away, but is that related to kind of what could be called a seventh ray type of work?
It definitely is.
Yeah.
Yeah, the seventh ray of ceremonial order of magic. Yeah, but it's funny, for me anyway, it's like I'll get these impressions and like I don't, unless they're sort of like, oh, you should talk to this person or bring this thing up or whatever. Some of these other impressions aren't, well defined at first. It's like, oh, like order. It's like, well, that can mean any number of things, and what's the specific thing that's happening there?
Well, it sort of cycles its way down, right? I mean, like it starts as this broad sort of general principle, and it cycles down.
Yeah. Well, and sometimes it's like, you get an impression of like two things put together, like, oh, this convenience store you visited one time, and then like, maybe there's some song that's going along with it that wasn't playing at the time, and then it's sort of like I follow the resonance of it instead of usually analyzing and putting the pieces together symbolically as what they might mean. But sometimes, the piece will just sort of unfold. It's like, oh, this convenience store represents this in one way, and the song is saying this, and you put those together, and that means something, and but not in a sort of dry, intellectual way. At least that's not how I do it.
Right. So it's like this totality of, it's intellectual, but also spiritual and kind of an emotional resonance too.
Yeah.
But by the way, can you hear me okay?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, I definitely know about this idea of, I mean, I guess it's sort of like a seed thought, but not exactly. This idea of a sort of a more broadly defined concept that enters your consciousness, and it comes to take on specific meanings, right? By interacting with the contents of your consciousness at that time. And it's sort of like it works its way. It almost works its way downward to a more concrete level of what's going on.
Well, there's also some inferiority complex about it for me. I mean, not usually, but sometimes I think about this because like the symbols I get are usually like things that happen or TV shows or people or they're not like these sort of like true like occult symbols or whatever. Like you see the square and then you understand the third subplane of the meaning of the square. It's usually like outer stuff and not seemingly pure symbols. I mean, that's probably a wrong way to look at it, but it's something that pops in my head sometimes.
Yeah. Well, everyday stuff can obviously take on profound meanings, but I know it's not necessarily that like pure occult knowledge from the higher planes or something.
The diamond in the star was revealed to me, and then I came to understand the whatever.
But see,
I wanted to.
there wouldn't be
Um,
any. Sorry, go.
no, you go.
Well, I was just gonna say then there wouldn't be any reason for your having watched every episode of Seinfeld and The Simpsons, and
That's true. That's true.
references can be embedded in a hierarchical system of occult knowledge.
And the Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time, and so forth.
Yeah.
What is the Deku tree? What does the Deku tree represent? And more importantly, the Triforce, perhaps. But speaking of like games and stuff, I wanted to talk about the thing we played last night. We were playing Dungeons and Dragons online, and we did this kind of like massive adventure where we were invited to dinner at this like powerful lord's castle who was actually a vampire. So we wound up like traipsing around this vampire's castle for how long were we there? Like 2 hours, maybe even like 3 hours.
Yeah, it was a couple hours, I'd say.
What did you think about that experience? Please tell it to me again after I already asked you before we started recording.
Yeah. I mean, it was a really cool quest. It's like you enter this castle, which is it was pretty enormous. I mean, I don't think we even explored the whole thing, did we?
No, there were many unexplored rooms, or at least a number of unexplored rooms.
Yeah, there's so many little winding stairways and stuff, and just floors full of arcane horror and sort of Transylvanian folly. It's a kind of almost like a vampire theme thing. Like this guy Count Strahd is the king of the castle. He's the count or whatever, and he's sort of like a Count Dracula type figure. He's like this kind of like Slavic warlord or something who's kind of vaguely a ghost or a vampire. And yeah, it's just like it's a really cool quest. It's very expansive. It must have taken a really long time to program it all, but it's cool.
So the original i6 Ravenloft. So it was originally this Dungeons and Dragons module that you played with pen and paper Dungeons and Dragons, and it was like this is where Strahd von Zarovich, I think that's how it's pronounced, was introduced, and the land of Ravenloft itself. But it had this interesting mechanic with like tarot cards and gypsies, except in this world it was called Taroka cards, and the gypsies were called Vistani. So this fortune teller meets you in the start of the castle, or maybe it's before the castle. I'm not sure. But anyway, so the dungeon master, the guy running the game for the players playing it, like draws three cards, like to tell their future, and whatever the three cards are represent a different part of the castle that the dungeon master knows about. So like the main boss is going to be this one place depending on where this card is, or this ally will show up in this one place depending on where the other card was. So it was a very kind of like interesting and creative adventure that it wasn't like everything was set out. It was sort of based on these tarot card drawings. And yeah, so they recreated that in the online adventure. Like you get your fortune drawn at the beginning of the adventure, and then based on that, certain things are in different places in the castle. But another interesting note about the original i6 Ravenloft module, what I've heard anyway, is that it was partially the inspiration for Bram Stoker's Dracula, like the movie version that came out, I think, in the 90s. Like obviously the book's much older than that, and the book was the inspiration for stuff, including i6 Ravenloft. But this idea, well, I mean, we haven't really got into it. But there's this theme in Ravenloft of like reincarnation, that like Dracula's lost love reincarnates, and he keeps trying to find her. And you see that in the Dracula movie from the 90s. And that sort of crops into this adventure setting here too. But that concept was, I think, originally introduced in the original i6 Ravenloft module. And then they sort of adapted it into the movie, which I found was very interesting. I don't know, maybe it came from someplace else and I heard some misinformation, but that's what I heard, and it's a pretty interesting idea.
That is really interesting, yeah. You know, I never actually saw Bram Stoker's Dracula. I saw, wasn't there like
Keanu Reeves. Keanu Reeves.
oh, that sounds great. Yeah.
Was John Harker? Was that his name?
What was there was some like silly version of Dracula? I think it was actually made by Wes Craven. It was in like the year 2000 or something.
Oh, was it Dracula 2000?
Maybe it was that. It was funny, but yeah, I remember seeing that one.
Yeah, they've made a lot of Dracula movies, and silly versions and stuff. Yeah, I mean they're fun to watch. I guess some of them anyway. But I think this idea and what it might represent, like going to the vampire's castle and like him being like having all this stuff going on, or all these treasures and traps and people he's sort of taken under his wing or controls or bound to him in some way. And the vampire sort of like being an undead, a reflection of the living in a distorted way. And it's sort of like, what if there was this ancient manor or house that was like, representing something true and good, or at least decent or okay. And then it's like pulled into, hell slowly, kind of the way adventurers are often through the mist, pulled into the plane of Ravenloft in D&D.
Yep.
And so it's like, the principle that like bad things are like always a corruption of good things, or a twisting of good things. And so like the vampire guy in his castle, it's like this powerful thing that was like good in the past has now been twisted into this kind of monstrous house.
Yeah. Well, it's like, to me, a lot of what a vampire represents is I mean, maybe we've talked about this dichotomy of the personality and the soul, right? The sort of the higher self that sort of um, that's there after you die, and that sort of like wants to keep things moving on a certain path, and is connected to the source and all that. And then the personality is like the basic you, like you as you exist right now, like your physical body and your feelings and stuff, as separate from that. And and so like I see the a vampire, one way of looking at what they represent is sort of like the personality resisting the soul and resisting death, and which is sort of the natural course of things for someone who's overly focused on the personality. And so I guess like the way I see it is sort of like the more you live like that, the more you become like that, you kind of have to suck people and things around you into that, because you're cut off from your source. And so it's like, it's like the whole drinking other people's blood thing. It's like you need to sort of parasitize the energy of others, and then they sort of become like you.
Yeah. And it occurred to me a different way to look at it is like forces in people's selves. Like let's say in past lives, or maybe just earlier in their current life, there some certain state of consciousness is like functioning, more or less okay, and then something happens that they did or somebody else did that sort of puts it down to this twisted sense. And then if it's from a past life, it's like they have that thing going on, and they don't see the history behind it, and it's just like, oh, there's this sort of like bad part of me that I don't want to deal with, or is bad. But if you see the story behind it, it's like you can sort of unravel what happened there and maybe redeem it, or put it into use, or right order, let's say. Well, and you've got to grapple with your past mistakes, don't you know? And you've got to lift that heavy burden and take responsibility.
Wait, slow down for our audience. What's the burden?
Well, the burden is this dead weight that's been created from something useful.
That was just my really poor attempt at a Joe Rogan impression.
We'll get there. We'll get there. The Joe
I,
Rogan.
I've never really tried to do his voice before, so
Joe
I
Rogan's tough. It's tough to do people's voices that are like
kind of subtle. It's
normal. Yeah.
no,
And frankly, like other people's voices, it's very easy to do, okay, folks, because their voice is just so distinct, okay?
yeah, I don't know if I could really do Joe Rogan's voice. I have too much of a natural baritone. His voice is like you have to actually use the muscles in the upper part of your neck. I didn't evolve that way.
But I think people have a lot of that kind of baggage of like good things about them that have become misused, and yeah, it's like looking out there to like get things that are good or make good things happen, but you've already got like a bunch of good stuff that's sort of misapplied within you. And if you can move some of that around,
I like that.
hopefully with like God's help or the Holy Spirit or higher self, whatever, then well, then you've really got something there, don't you?
Well, yeah, it's like
Something that makes the unbearable suffering of life worth living.
Jamie, pull up the unbearable suffering of life. Um, you know, it reminds me of this idea of um, consulting, right? Like in business, the whole idea of the whole business of corporate consulting, which I read a book about that like a while back. Um, it's actually a really good book. If anyone's interested in that kind of thing, it's a book called The Lords of Strategy. And they talk about like how basically I guess it was maybe starting in the early century, but more in the middle of the 20th century, a bunch of people who were sort of engineers and stuff like that started going into business and sort of developing these ideas around mapping out businesses sort of like as systems, and like, oh, you're putting these resources into that, but maybe if they went here, and maybe if you identified the following uh, key issues and used my 4-step system or whatever. It's about like sort of looking at a business very systemically and with flow charts and diagrams and stuff, and saying, okay, well, here's how your perspective on this has been wrong and has been leading to you misapplying resources, and that's leading to you losing money. And it's sort of like, it's a similar thing, but with a person, right? Like, because someone can just have a bad quote unquote business strategy, like just have this bad idea about how to go about things, and in the long term that sort of iterates into being Count Strahd or something, like being just this evil vampire because you just weren't looking at things correctly.
Well, and maybe in more benign scenarios than an evil vampire, right?
Yeah.
Symbolically.
Yeah.
Like, in relationships, like you talk to somebody and it just becomes unproductive every time you talk to them. But, if you shifted one thing, maybe it would go in a better direction.
Yeah. Well, and it's like people's back to that idea we kind of started with. It's like people's ideas about the bigger things, or people's sort of, I don't know if you'd even call them ideals, but like the sort of abstract big picture notion that people have, I do believe kind of trickles down, like iterates downward to where it affects the way you go about everyday stuff.
What do you mean by big picture abstract stuff?
Like, well, like your sense, just your sense of the world. Like maybe you have a specific kind of Catholic worldview, and like God is definitely like this, and here's Jesus, but also the church is a certain way, and that's for a reason, and because of all that, the world is like this, and here's why here are my ideals, and here's they represent motivations for acting in the world. And I just think that or it could be like I'm kind of a skeptic, agnostic, and I'm unsure about everything, and we might just be in a void, but maybe because the void won't admit of a solid yes or no, so I actually don't know, but we are. But I mean, I'm blabbering a little, but the point being that it's like whatever your view is of the bigger picture of um, life and the universe, even if that means that you don't really have that solid view of it, that sort of iterates downward, right? That trickles down, and it affects how you act in everyday life. I think, like those patterns come to inform how you look at everyday life.
Well, it's sort of like the ancient belief of the gods being up in the sky, in the stars, and that
Right.
the constellations are sort of like seen as the gods. I mean, well, that's sort of the basis of astrology, that the constellations influence people. But it's sort of like what you've projected up into the heavens, into this narrative, the way you see the world, reflects down into your sort of day-to-day interactions, if I understand what you're saying.
Yeah, something like that. Yeah. But I think, like one thing I've been grappling with a little is this idea of,
Do you have the improved grappling feat, Nick? So you get plus 40 of grappling
oh,
feat?
that's the problem. I don't, and I have like a low dexterity, but I think that
And you also provoke attacks of opportunity if you don't have improved grapple to start a grapple, under third edition D&D rules.
it's true.
But we'll work with the feats we have.
The best way to win is not to play. But I mean, I have this kind of thing I've been grappling with, and I don't know if I want to start off with the whole idea, but it's like I feel like not having, like, the way things used to be, and people, I don't want to talk too much about sixth ray, seventh ray. I mean, in the previous age, there was more of an energy of devotional idealism, and there was that sort of the religion that went along with that, and there was a sensibility that went along with that,
For
and
the
the way,
last roughly around 2,000 years. I think a little bit more than that, but that's the idea.
yeah. And I think that a lot of what's happened is that it was decided that those big questions that were answered by that specific, whether you call it just the religion or like the philosophy that's entailed and all that. At a certain point, a lot of people started saying, "Well, I don't. This isn't real to me," or like, "I don't. These questions are unresolvable, or they don't matter." And I'm gonna kind of leave that alone, and I'm gonna focus on my sort of, you know, my immediate world and like how I can further my own interests or like protect my family or whatever. And I see it, sort of as like, picture like Humphrey Bogart and Casablanca, or some kind of like film noir kind of thing of like, oh, I'm just out for myself, and hey, you mug, and don't pull up your hat to look at me when I'm pulling down the brim of my hat. But like, it's this sort of like, it becomes more about transactional stuff and the immediate surroundings. And I think that iterates downward, as I was saying, like it so that initial abdication of responsibility for solving the big problems, understandable as it might be in a certain sense, I think that over time it trickles down. And so we start looking at this kind of, this almost like tortured subjectivism comes down into the level of people's everyday thinking, to where you can't quite, no problem is really that simple. You can't really quite define or judge anything for sure. And, instead of being responsible for like solving some problem, it's like, oh, well, it's more complicated than that, or you can't talk about that problem, or, um,
Well, so it's like because people accepted something that was sort of not fully justified to them, and it was sort of based on a loose foundation, whether or not it was true, it then leads to rejecting that thing and saying like, oh, there is no truth or everything's subjective, or I'll just do what I
Well,
want.
that's the gist of it. I'm talking about how it, how it happens over time. It's like there's this idealism, this high idealism that sort of reaches its half life almost. And at a certain point, it's like, well, this stuff doesn't have reference to. I don't know what this actually is. These big problems of the universe are like not solvable, or they don't matter. And I don't care. I'm just gonna focus on like being a detective in Morocco or whatever, or owning a bar, and and like yeah, I and so that gradually what you've accepted on the abstract high level, even if that's ostensibly a rejection of that level of thinking, it's still there. That level of thinking is still there. The way you see the universe at large still affects you over time. And so I believe that leads to this sort of like what I think we see more of today, which is like this kind of ridiculous level of subjectivism, this tendency to like avoid problems, to avoid defining things so that you're not responsible for like seeing and acting on how things are, or acting on trying to solve a problem and being responsible for how well you do at that. I don't know if I'm really like explaining it the way that it should be explained, but I think I'm giving the general
Well,
idea.
yeah, it was this solid foundation. Well, it wasn't really a solid foundation because it wasn't, totally thought through, but it was accepted as solid. That God says this, and you should do certain things and whatever. With all the corruption that existed, and people not doing the right thing and whatever. But then that goes away, and now it's sort of like, oh well, truth is whatever you make of it. And I think the next step is to sort of reconstruct what was valuable about those past ideas or ideals, and also to like understand them. Like, I mean, the whole thing about not having sex before you're married. I mean, there's all sorts of kind of more obvious reasons not to do that, like unwanted pregnancy, STDs and stuff. So these are things that like people can like think about and like realize. But like for me anyway, this idea I heard about first in Subud of like when you have sex with somebody, you're literally like mixing your like psychic energy with them, and you're like tying yourself
Yep.
together with them a certain way. So if you're just doing that with like some random person that you don't even know if they're like a good person or not, you're like taking on their sort of like psychic baggage onto yourself, and that's like
I think
really like potentially a sort of like holding you back spiritually and emotionally and stuff. And so just like having sex with somebody that you don't understand, that you're not in a committed relationship with, it's like taking your energy and like just like mixing it up with this other person's energy. And it's like that's great if you're gonna like keep working together and have this union. But if you're just gonna like pull it apart and you haven't even considered if these two energies fit together, like yin and yang, then it's like just this chaotic thing that'll probably have a bunch of unintended consequences energetically and
I,
psychically.
I think it's the source of a lot of misery today. I think like it's understandable that people don't necessarily see a problem with casual sex, and there's obvious forces sort of like colluding to make you take part in it. But yeah, I think it's the source of a lot of misery. I don't think people really understand it.
Well, there's almost like reverse pressure. In the past there was pressure to like wait till you're married, and shame for not doing what was expected in those times. But now there's almost sort of like shame for like, oh, you're a virgin, or oh, you haven't waited or whatever. I mean, I guess it depends what circles you run in, but yeah, I
Yeah,
mean,
definitely.
yeah. So that's an interesting phenomenon. Yeah, like the sort of religious ideology falls away, and then the secular ideology becomes more and more religious because there's this vacuum of sort of belief or faith.
Yeah.
You got to believe in something. In this video Benjamin Boyce did with I forget what her name was, but she's this Jungian psychologist. She was talking about some idea that somebody put out there of like you can't not worship. You have to worship something, and
I
it
think I've heard.
seems like that's true. I mean, she didn't mention it, but as far as I'm aware, the word worship comes from the word work. That's what it really means to work for something. So it's like to
I mean,
worship
maybe
God,
it's
to worship God isn't just like, oh yay, you're so great or whatever. Which is kind of the way I think most people think of it, but it's actually to like do service for or work for. So it's like what idea or entity or power are you serving or working for? Are you working for your own desires? Are you working for somebody else's benefit? Are you working for some concept or idea? Everybody's working for worshiping something in some way.
I would say like it might be a little fanciful, but the way I look at it is that consciousness is sort of like it's time. It's based in time, right? It exists in time, and it's based upon the idea of priority. Ordering things in terms of priority, which is sort of a basis of or a part of the process of decision. And priority, when you say worship, it's like if you think things out, there's an inevitable sort of, I don't know, it's like there's inevitably something that sort of at least hypothetically takes the first priority, even if you never like directly encounter or act on, you know, the word of God in that sense, like that thing itself. It's like implicitly that exists. Like it's so because all of consciousness is about prioritizing. It's about I'm going to think about this, not that. I'm going to do this, not that. I would rather this than that happen, and that makes me feel a certain way. It's all in a sense about choosing putting one thing in front of the other.
Yeah,
And
there's
so
a hierarchy.
there's implicitly like an alpha thing that's like the top thing.
It's interesting the link between hierarchy and consciousness as you're laying it out there. I hadn't thought of that before, because the hierarchy, the spiritual hierarchy that is of this planet, corresponds to like the second aspect of God, the Son, the Christ, consciousness, the soul, and it's interesting to see that word kind of apply to consciousness itself.
All is hierarchy.
So it has been said.
Grom.
Well, I think it's a pretty good note to end it on. What do you think, Nick?
Yeah, that's okay with me.
All right. And everybody, make sure to like, share, subscribe, and hit that notification bell if you want to find out about future videos. Till then, light and love to you all. Live long and prosper.
Deep thoughts, y'all.